Robert and Laura decided they would take not only the historic tour, but the ghost tour of the old Missouri State Prison site in Jefferson City. They arrived with other folks, got the instructions, their flashlights, and through most of the tour they were led by a tour guide explaining the events and telling the stories of ghosts there at the prison. But for a while they were on their own in cell block A. Laura was just a little ahead of Robert, and she heard her name called out, "Laura, Laura." And she turned, assuming that it was Robert, but Robert was further behind her. And as she turned back again, she noticed for just a minute, there in cell number 19, the shadowy appearance of a man. He had an old straw hat, bib overalls, but no sooner than she'd recognized that it was a man, and he disappeared. Robert came up to her and she said, Robert, I saw a ghost." "Well, we have to report it," he said. So they immediately went to the tour guide and reported that they had had an experience with something in cell number 19. And the tour guide took down the notes saying, "Well, we haven't had reports of cell number 19, but this is good. It's always good to add another ghost to our collection." In the next few days afterward, Laura kept thinking about that encounter, and she approached Robert and said, "We need to go back. What we need to do is do the overnight stay at the prison and do our ghost hunting ourselves." And reluctantly, Robert agreed. They had to sign up with a larger group, but it was set. And that night, they camped out in cell block A. Sometime in the middle of the night, as expected, Laura heard, "Laura, Laura." And there she stood facing cell number 19. The full figure of this man emerged. Straw hat, bib overalls. He stood just behind the bars of the cell as if he was grasping them and sometimes reaching out, saying, "Laura, Laura." Robert was at her side. He witnessed it too, attempted to take a photograph, and then he was gone. Well, they reported this again to the tour guide and showed them what they had photographed, and all they saw was a kind of a globe of soft light. The tour guide explained this is often what people see and often what gets recorded by camera. But sure enough, it was a ghost. In the next few days and weeks after that, Laura kept thinking about that experience. And one night she awakened Robert saying, "He's here, he's here." Robert said, "What?" "He's here, I saw him, he's here." "No, it's just a dream," Robert said. "No, he was in our room, he was walking toward me, he's here." Robert tried to calm her by saying, "No, remember what they told us. The ghosts at the prison site are residual. They're like memories that are locked inside the stone walls. They don't leave the prison." "No," she insisted, "he's here." And to confirm her suspicions, over the next few days, she had other encounters with this figure in their home. In fact, she was in the kitchen one afternoon looking out and saw him crossing the yard toward her. Well, that was enough to prompt them to do some research to find out who this ghost was. They checked out every book on the history of the prison, every document they could find, even looking at the prison files in the state archives, and they found out who he was. He was one Walter Everett. Shortly after World War II, Walter had been farming in the area around Jefferson City, trying to do his own farm and being employed by other farmers. His intent was to raise enough money so that he could marry his girlfriend, Laura Simpson, from a neighboring farm. He was farming one afternoon, and Laura had brought lunch out to him. She'd come out to the tractor in the field. They'd had lunch, and she left and went across the field and through a little patch of woods. Tragically, she was bitten by a rattlesnake, collapsed, and died, not discovered by Walter until that evening when it was too late. Walter was overcome by grief and guilt. He had been working that summer for Arthur Medford on his farm, but there were times that he would find himself just standing out in the field, staring out into nowhere in the depths of melancholy and depression. One afternoon, he drove back to the Medford farm in his old truck, walked into the barn, fashioned a noose, and tried to hang himself. Couldn't do it. He came out of the barn door holding the rope. When Arthur and his friends were sitting up on the porch having a beer and saw this pathetic figure walk out into the middle of the barnyard, Arthur stood up and reached down and grabbed a handful of shotgun shells that were beside a shotgun that was by the porch railing, threw them out into the barnyard, and said, "Need some ammunition? Maybe this will help." And they all laughed. Walter reached down, picked up the shells, threw them back at the porch. Arthur then looked around, grabbed a pitchfork and then an axe and threw them out into the barnyard and said, "Maybe try one of these. Maybe you can do it." And they all laughed. Walter simply turned, went back to his pickup, got in, and started to drive directly toward the porch. Arthur reached down, got the shotgun, blasted through, breaking out the window of the pickup. The pickup halted, but Walter stepped out of the pickup with a rifle in hand. Again, Arthur aimed the shotgun one more time, blasted the front of the pickup, but Walter took slow and steady aim and dropped Arthur dead on the porch. Then turned around, got back into that truck, and drove off. Well, the ambulance, the sheriff's department arrived, and Walter was arrested. He was on trial and convicted of murder. Now, perhaps it might have been self-defense, but the Medfords had friends in law enforcement and on the jury, and Walter went to prison. It was at that time that the prison system had established a new alternative form of corrections. They had established the church, farm, and auxiliary site. And Walter was sent out to farm. He was able to wear his farm clothing, and there he worked with wheat and alfalfa and the dairy. And he was good at his job, but there still were those occasions when he would be out in the field staring out into nowhere, sometimes an hour at a time. It did not work. They took him back to the prison, and he was put in cell 19. And in a few days, Walter did manage to commit suicide, hanging himself with some of his clothing. When Robert and Laura had understood the history, now Laura said, "We have to go back. I want to encounter the ghost of Walter one more time." Robert did not want to do it, but Laura insisted. And so once again, they were scheduled to take the ghost tour at the prison site, and immediately when they could, went to cell block A. Laura stood in front of cell number 19, Robert nearby. And in the night, once again, she heard her name, "Laura, Laura." And there, appearing to both of them, was the figure of Walter Everett, standing behind the cell, but then as if he went through the cell. Laura closed her eyes and felt the cold embrace. Robert said later that it looked like for a moment Laura had disappeared and then appeared fainted and fell to the floor. When she was revived, she was okay. In fact, she was calm and confident that Walter's grief had been resolved. And in fact, no subsequent sightings have been made of Walter Everett. And perhaps he is at peace. Well, unless you should happen to visit the prison and your name is Laura.